What are you thirsty for? Happy Thirsty Thursday with me, Jake Thurston. Today we're looking at the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy is a recap of the entire law of Moses. It's the book of the law. It's basically the long list of commands that Israel needed to obey once when they got into the land of Israel. So if you know the story of the Israelites, they leave Egypt from the Exodus. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years. They get into a lot of trouble, and God basically says, you're not going to go into the promised land. Your next generation will. So Deuteronomy is Moses' recap of everything that they've already touched on before. So that way the new generation knows exactly what they need to do, exactly how they need to live, and exactly how they need to worship God and have a relationship with Him once when they enter into the promised land. So when you flip through these pages of Deuteronomy, you see things like rules for what it means to be, like the curses that go into being disobedient, or the first fruits and tithes, and how to sacrifice stuff on the altars, and how to, deal with people who are labeled as unclean, and foods that you shouldn't eat, and these cities of refuge that people need to go to if they kill someone on accident, and goodness, just so many other things. How to celebrate the Passover, I'm just looking at these, like what offerings priests and Levites should give. Like there's so many things in like 30 chapters of this book of the Bible talk about these laws. And we look at those laws and think, how could anyone in their right mind be able to do all this stuff? They're so detailed. There's so much expectation. It just seems like God's standard for His people seemed completely unattainable. But then you get to Deuteronomy chapter 30. And basically, to kind of summarize up to verse 11, Moses is saying that the greatest command you could do is to obey the Lord in all these things, and He will make you prosperous when you honor His covenant, when you obey Him. And in verse 11 through 14, Moses says this to his people. Now, what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so you may obey it. In other words, obeying the Lord in all these things is not as hard as you think it is. In fact, God's expectation for you to be a holy and righteous people, a holy priesthood to the world and to the nations, is very realistic and it's very doable. So for you to think that it's completely over your heads and it's impossible to live this way, you're just mistaken. And I'm like, man, how often do we do the exact same thing? We look at God's commands that He gives us, and the command to live righteously and to be chaste and to love people and to forgive, and so much of even what we would have had to do in the Old Testament has been reduced because of what Jesus has done and us living in the Holy Spirit and Him empowering us to live out these commands. You could argue that things are a little bit easier for us than it was for the Israelites, but yet we still think His commands are too difficult for us or beyond our reach. But according to Moses here, they're not too far out of reach. And if we ever think that we are incapable of obeying God's commands and living up to His standards, I think it's safe to say that you're wrong if you think that you can't do it. Because God believes that you can. And He wants to help us to actually achieve and do these realistic commands.